Good morning, everyone. My name is Bilal Orfali, and I'm the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies and the Chair of the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages at the American University of Beirut. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel featuring three of the best writers on this planet. And the title of the panel is Relationships Under Strain, featuring Clare Mackintosh, Edugyan, and Tayari Jones. I feel a little bit silly introducing these very accomplished authors, but I kind of need to do that. Edugyan is the author of the novels The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, Half-Blood Blues, and Washington Black. I'll be focusing on Washington Black actually today. She won a lot of prizes. It will take me 15 minutes to just name them, but she is a twice winner of the Giller Prize. Clare Mackintosh, with more than 2 million copies of her books sold worldwide, #1 bestseller, Clare Mackintosh is the multi-award winning author. Her novels, I Let You Go, I See You, Let Me Lie, some of her books were translated to Arabic, and all three of her books were selected for the Richard and Judy Book Club. I will be focusing on Clare's latest novel, After the End, which, by the way, spent 7 weeks in the Sunday Times hardback bestseller chart. Tayari Jones is the author of 4 novels, most recently An American Marriage, which I will be focusing on today, was selected for Oprah's Book Club and Barack Obama's Summer Reading List and End of Year Roundup. It won the Women's Prize for Fiction and many, many, many other awards. Please join me in welcoming our 3 authors. Pleasure. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
I have a question. I have many questions, but I'll start with a common question. That's what I'm here for. But what strikes me is that all your characters are ordinary people. These stories, or some of these stories, not the historical one, but the other ones, can happen to any of us and can happen suddenly. The novels you recently wrote examine how pressure of culture affects characters' relationships. My question to you is this: can literature help us make the right decisions for us? Life is about decisions. Do you think literature can help us cope with stress in our everyday relations, since this panel is about relations under stress? Please.
Good question to start. I'm going to dive in. I think books absolutely can help us make sense of what's going on, both externally and internally. What books enable us to do is to live someone else's life for a bit, to empathize, to walk in their footsteps in a way that is very difficult for us to do otherwise. And that process of following someone else's journey, if it mirrors your own, is very helpful in fathoming out what you should do. And sometimes, even if it's a completely different world, it seems to unlock something inside you that I think is really helpful.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in some cases, you feel as though you've been given permission, reading somebody else's story and seeing how they've responded to something, and maybe it was in a negative way that made them look terrible, but maybe you have also felt these feelings, and it's sort of, I guess it's very consoling in that sense. And I mean, not that literature is a roadmap, but seeing somebody confronting challenges that either mirror your own, or in some cases, look nothing like your own life. I think that this can inform your own decisions and your own thinking, and this idea of seeing that, you're not alone in the world in facing dire situations. Everybody has things that they're confronting and going through.
Tayari, what do you think?
I think I've been thinking about this quite a lot lately, and I think it can really go either way, because I know a lot of what I read as a young person. I read some really problematic things as a young person that gave me kind of ridiculous ideas about life. Literature is very powerful, so it really depends on what you're reading. It can influence, I mean, I think that literature at its best is a subversive force to kind of shake loose some deeply held cultural beliefs that may not be serving you as the person you are. But you can read kind of the wrong things or things from a different point of view and further marginalize yourself. So it really depends on what you're reading, which is why I think that writers must be responsible and search very hard to try to find a truth that is in the direction of a more just, humane, equitable world. Because literature is, you feel in that moment, you are under the sway of the writer. You're under the spell of the writer. And as a writer, you have to be careful what spells you cast.
I'm sorry, I would be curious to know what you read as a youth.
Oh my good! I used to read these weird as a kid. I used to read these weird kind of teenage romances. They would sell them to us in a box. The box would have like 6 of them, and it'd be like all these like blonde people on them frolicking, and there were like football players involved and cheerleaders. Like,
were
I
they
don't think
always
that's
the same
healthy.
story, or just with different different names and places?
Well, I didn't understand them to be the same story, but that's another thing. You get continued exposure to the same story, and it starts to feel like it makes sense.
And like it should be the truth.
Yeah, just like if you watch too much television, you can start thinking stupid thoughts.
Right, or like this
For me, literature helped me understand these subtle emotions that people go through in their lives, right? Like loss and relations and etc. So, Essie, let me start with you. Your protagonist in Washington Black is a slave who became friends with his master. This friendship was never a relation between equals, and it can never be. Why is that?
Yeah, I think, well, for those of you who haven't read the novel, it's about an 11-year-old slave boy who gets taken to live in the quarters of his new master's brother, a man called Christopher Wilde, and this man essentially ends up saving his life. He teaches him to read, but mainly to draw and to help him with his scientific endeavors. And then Wash begins to understand that he's extremely gifted and in fact something of a prodigy when it comes to scientific endeavors. And so I think their relationship starts in a very fraught way because Washington is chosen simply because of his size and because he might be great at hauling scientific equipment, and this is what Titch initially sees in him. And so he's completely shocked to discover that, here's a boy who is so gifted and so smart, and he would never have expected this of him when he first laid eyes on him. And so, because of where the relationship started and also the circumstances of history, this being the 1830s, and this white man being essentially a kind of master, this can never be a relationship of equals. And the whole novel is exploring this. There are times when it seems like they're very much on an equal footing. They're very much like-minded men, but the gulf is too great.
Tayari, Roy Hamilton is a young Southern black man who is going places, right? After college, he landed himself a good job and a wonderful wife named Celestial. She's also very ambitious and successful. But his life runs violently off the rails when he is convicted of a rape he didn't commit. And both know that he didn't commit rape. So there was no doubt about this. An American Marriage is a powerful, subtle, sad tale about the criminal justice system in America and the personal long-term consequences of its injustices. It's a tragic love story. Like all your other novels, it takes place in Atlanta. In one of your interviews, it struck me that you stressed the topos of the wife that waits for her husband, the Odyssey, right? The Odyssey topos. For example, in a very recent interview, you also named The Odyssey as a book that influenced you. Your female protagonist does not follow the steps of Penelope. She leads her own life. It's a feminist story as well. She cannot be owned, as the third character in the love triangle declares in the novel. Can you comment more on her feminist characters? Have human relations changed since the Odyssey?
When I was writing An American Marriage, and I said I was going to write a novel about a couple separated by wrongful conviction, there's an expectation then that this novel is going to be one strong woman's fight to free her man, right? You know, she's going to suffer beautifully, because we really admire women to the extent to which they can suffer, and we call this strength. And I wasn't interested in that. I thought it was narratively, I thought it was boring. I thought that ideologically it was problematic. And also, where is the conflict in that? For a novel, you really need this kind of friction. And I came to write this plot because I saw a couple arguing in the mall. And the woman said to her husband, I think he was her husband, she said, "Roy, you know you would not have waited on me for 7 years." And I thought she was absolutely right. Of course he would not have waited on her for 7 years. And he did not say, "Of course I would." He said, "This wouldn't have happened to you in the first place." So
he's also right.
He's also right. So he felt like the question of reciprocity was irrelevant to him. And there was this idea that her role in mitigating his suffering was through this very traditional role. And I was really interested in how does that feel today? And one, do real people still do it? And what are the consequences of not doing it? And what does that mean for gender? And is feminism considered to be a luxury that can only happen when times are good? Because in their marriage, when they first get married, you know, they have these ideas of being a modern couple. But once he goes to prison, everybody shuts down that and say they need her to be in the Penelope model. But if that means that, and then when I was researching marriage, I looked at novels about women who leave marriages, and they were almost all novels by middle-class white women who were just like, I don't feel the way I think I should feel, and I want to go, you know, I don't know, eat, pray, love, you know, whatever she wants to do.
Live.
But
Just live.
novels by black women only left a marriage if it was violent. She had to be running for her life. There was no sense of just wanting to be happier.
Thank you. Claire, after the end is a story of Pip and Max, parents to Dylan, who is critically ill with a brain tumor. It is a devastating and yet life-affirming story of the truly transformative power of love that a parent has for a child, and the length that they will go for them. I must admit that you shocked me in this book. I expected a thriller when I first started reading it, especially that it starts with the court, but you also touched me deeply. Everyone in this room has suffered loss of a thing or a beloved or a loved one, so we all suffer loss. You say also that this book is not just about death, it's about life too. It's about getting better and about building your life after loss. And we've all been to these places, these emotional places. One of the characters in the book declares, "In grief, I feel you might have to go through your own journey." Why is that? Can literature help?
Yes, literature does help, both reading it and writing it. So grief is something I think about an awful lot. It's been a part of my life for a very long time. My son died in 2006. And so it's very difficult for me to think about living as an adult without grief. It's a thread that runs through it. And in the early days, reading about grief, reading about other people's grief, was a really good way of working through some of those emotions that actually were too painful to think about. I couldn't really listen to my own thoughts on it, but I could read other people's, and so that was a great help. And in writing about it, many years later, so 12 years later, I eventually wrote the book that I'd wanted to write all those years previously. And in order to really do the characters justice and the story justice, and to make the book as authentic as I wanted it to be, so that it really spoke to people, I needed to open that box that I shut away inside myself and access those feelings that I'd locked away for 12 years. And the process of doing that, whilst unbearably painful at times, was incredibly cathartic. And I think I probably finally went through that grieving process while I wrote the book.
Right, so writing it was difficult, but also not writing it was somehow more difficult, right? Because Maya Angelou says there is no pain like a suppressed story, like a story that haven't been told, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to write this book when it all happened, when my son died. But actually, I know now that I couldn't have written it, because the very title of the novel, After the End, it's not about the trauma. It's not really about the loss. It's about what happens afterwards. And I remember thinking in 2006 that was it. That was the end of any chance of happiness. It was the end of life as I knew it. And I couldn't see a way forward. I needed those intervening years to realize that I would laugh again, I would run again, I would be happy again, and that there was a whole world ahead of me, because that's exactly the message that one gets from the novel.
See, I want to go back to you, and your protagonist escaped to freedom, of course. I like that the novels kind of begins with that, right? Doesn't end with that. One of the themes of the novels, I think, is the meaning of being free, life beyond slavery, notions of freedom, but also the limits of freedom, the limits of being free. How did this past of the protagonist affect his future?
I mean, it's enormous for him. It's having been born and raised on a plantation is the thing that sets the trajectory for his whole life. He imagines that, when he is on the plantation before Christopher Wilde arrives, he can't conceive of another life. It's he assumes that his days will look as they've always looked, and that he will likely die prematurely, and through brutal means, and that's just his inheritance. That's how his life is going to be. And so when he's taken away from the plantation and given a chance to live out a kind of freedom, I guess, he is, he doesn't really know how to process this and what to do with this. And when he was on the plantation, he was told by a slave who had known freedom and who came to the plantation from Africa, so she had some notions of what it meant to be a free woman. She had told him that freedom was, a very basic thing. It's, you're physically free, and meaning that you don't have to, you don't have to work if you don't want to work. You don't have to be beholden to others through intimate relationships. These kinds of things. And when she tells him these things, he's very struck by this, because he can't even conceive of even that. But when he goes out into the world, he finds that there are ways in which he is, although he's physically free, he is still very much not mentally free. There are huge barriers that he's working with. He's full of guilt. He's full of rage. He's barely able to process this, and obviously he's full of grief. And he doesn't really understand what it means to be able to make your way in the world as being who he is. And of course, there are ways in which society will never allow him certain liberties. He's just not going to be able to have those. But I think the whole novel is like the process of him working his way towards a kind of psychological freedom. And whether he fully achieves that in the end, I don't know.
Beautiful.
But he's on the way there. So.
Beautiful. Tayari, I was particularly moved by the letters that Celestial and Roy exchanged while he was in the prison. I think this is my favorite part of the book. They offer a snapshot of Celestial and Roy's changing feelings, expressed directly to each other, without the need to perform their relationship to others. The truth of their fading affections becomes evident in their words. Do you think this is inevitable in relations?
Do I think that is inevitable that if one person is in prison, the
Right.
relationship will fade? I think it depends on the personality of the people. I mean, there are people who marry people who are in
Right.
prison because, they say that if you marry a man in prison, you always know where he is. And, there are people who enjoy that dynamic.
Yeah.
But for this particular couple, she's ambitious, she's living her life, and he is far away. I mean, there's a moment near the end of the book when she's telling someone her problems, and the guy says, prison is hard, but distance and time is the hardest thing. That it is unreasonable to expect people to be able to conduct a marriage when they can't see each other, when they can't spend time. We make this seem like of course you can do it, but if she says marriage is not just about your heart, it's about sharing your life, and they are not sharing their lives. And that it's a challenge, and I just feel like it's unreasonable to expect ordinary people to be able to meet this. There's a moment when Celestial's saying when she was growing up, her mother and father would say to her, when you're black, you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. Like, I always grew up hearing that. You have to work twice as hard to get half as much. And that's true now in their marriage. For her and him to have a marriage, which all kinds of random people have marriages. Like, you don't have to be special to have a marriage. People get married all the time. People stay married all the time. Ordinary people. But for them to stay married, they would have to work twice as hard for half as much.
I have a related question. There are several strong marriages in the book, right? In American marriage. Roy's parents, Celestial parents, even Andre's father and stepmother, etc. What makes a relation work, in your opinion?
I think marriages are about I'm not even married, y'all. No rings. But that said, from my point of view of not being in a marriage, it seems to me that it's about compatibility. It's not who's right and who's wrong, that the people have to want the same thing. Because Roy's parents have a very strong marriage, but they want the same thing. These are two people who have completely dedicated their lives to the care and feeding of their son. If either one of them wanted something else, it would cause the marriage to go off the rails. But they're not particularly ambitious. They just want to raise their family, which is fine because they want the same thing. And that, I find that that's really the key. It's not about this person has the right idea, this person has the wrong idea. They just have to have the same idea.
Claire, I have a related question also on what makes marriages work, right? You stress in the first part of the book the strength of the relation between the couples. At some point, they even said nothing can go wrong, right? Something like that. And as a reader, I kind of guessed what's going to happen, right? Is this inevitable in your opinion? Can marriages survive such an experience of losing a child?
Well, mine has. Touch wood so far. Still married. It's really tough. It's tough to go through an experience like that. And in the novel, it's compounded because we're not just talking about the loss of a child. What happens to Pip and Max, the couple in After the End, is that they disagree on the most fundamental of things. They disagree on whether their son should live or die. Should they fight for treatment, or should they remove him from intensive care and let him pass away? And it's a decision on which there's no compromise. And when my husband and I had to make that decision, I asked the doctor what would happen if we didn't agree, because like most marriages, we disagreed on all sorts of things, and they never mattered before. And the doctor paused for the longest time, and she said, you have to, because the alternative is unthinkable. And so the novel's about the unthinkable. And we see what happens to that marriage in different scenarios. People, you mentioned earlier how in the novel it says that grief is a journey, and we all travel that journey in different ways. You probably all know about the steps to grieving. You know, people go through denial and anger, and those steps can be different lengths, and so you fall out of sync. And Tayari just talked about wanting the same things, you know, just sort of traveling in the same direction. And I think what grief does is it derails that, because suddenly you're both traveling a path at different stages. You're going in the same direction, but at different speeds, and that puts you out of sync. And so what you have to do is either part ways, or you need to work out how you can kind of wait for the other person to get to the next stage of the journey, because eventually you do catch up with each other, I think. And certainly that's been my experience.
I have another question for you. So I got interested in Layla, right, Dylan's doctor. We often focus on the parents' pain and ignore the relations formed between nurses, doctors, and the ill kids. And I have a cousin who takes care of ill kids, and she often tells me how she feels. Can you tell us more about this? Why did you get Layla out or off the novel in the second part, except for a few occurrences, right? While the first part was also about her story, right?
So Layla is the intensive care pediatrician who looks after this boy, Dylan, in the first half of the novel. She's an Iranian doctor. I loved writing her, and I spent far too long researching her, working with an Iranian teacher, learning about Persian food and culture, and I wrote far too much, and my editor made me take out about 25,000 words because I'd sort of gone down a rabbit hole of her story. So I'll be returning to her, I think, at some point. She's very present in the first half of the novel, because the first half of the novel takes place in hospital or around hospital. She can't really be present in the second half because it's this bizarre scenario, I suppose, where you're in intensive care. Your entire life revolves around that one ward. You know, as parents, you don't go anywhere else, and so the doctor is there all the time, and every decision that has to be made, every update, they are your sort of personal god for those months that you're in hospital. And then you leave, either with your child or without your child, and you don't see that doctor again, ever. And I thought about our doctors all the time, but I have no idea where they are now, what they're, whether they ever think about the children, whether they think about my child, the other children that they had. And I wanted to reflect that in the novel, that we have an almost abrupt departure. We're torn out of her life because those parents no longer have that contact. So we do see her again. We do find out a little bit about what happens to her, but it is almost a bereavement in itself.
Thank you. Elsie, you mentioned that the biggest challenge of post-slavery is restoring broken family relations, right? Family relations. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, obviously, I think one of the most damaging things psychologically for slaves were these abrupt disconnections that happened with families. I mean, certain members would be taken, certain members would be sold away from plantations. People were not living in what we think of as traditional family units. And this was really, I think, the main psychological warfare and lasting trauma of slavery, because you do have a sense that you are any kind of a love relationship or a deep connection that you're making, that there's always a risk implicit in it, and that this person will very likely be at some point completely lost to you. And so what kind of true connections can you be making in the face of that? It's, I think it's something where, and we're still living with this, with the prison system, right? That these connections are being broken and whole families are being torn apart, and that this is creating untenable situations.
Thank you. One thing that I really liked about this novel in particular is that it's not just historical, right? I mean, you do not focus on the historical events in as much as you focus on what happens to people during and in reaction to these events. Do you want to comment on your approach to historical writing? Because you wrote more than one historical novel, right? So your approach to that.
Yeah, I think I've written only historical novels, it seems. And when I set out to write books, I never thought I would be a historical novelist. It wasn't, my idea when I heard the words historical novel. I just thought, oh my God, I thought of bodices. And, I thought, this is not something I'm at all interested in. But it so happens that I guess I am. And I think part of how I come to these stories, though, it's always through some kind of a sideways approach. For Washington Black, it started with a footnote in a book that I was reading about Victorian England, and then reading a story by Borges, and linking those things, and then wanting to explore the life of this 11-year-old slave that Washington was based on. And for Half-Blood Blues, again, it was another footnote. And I think, for me, my approach to all fiction is to want to explore the inner lives of people. And so I'm not so much interested in the whole historical context, and that's something that comes later, and that I have to build, and I have to create these worlds, and I have to do the research. But it always starts with the human being at the center of those stories.
And with the footnotes. I'm a scholar. I always tell my students, you have to read the footnotes.
Yes,
They're
exactly.
more
That's
important than the
most
text.
interesting.
Start with the footnotes, then the text. Tayari, I want to go back to you. There has been, rightly, a lot of attention on life in prison, right? There has been less of a focus on the partners who are outside, suffering silently. Can you talk about the choice to center this book on Celestial? Because it could have been otherwise, right? To make it about her experience as much as maybe even more so than Roy's.
Well, I was just thinking of what you just said about how the prison system does mirror the slave system, in that families are torn apart. And just like in the slave system, the idea was like these people who are enslaved don't have the same needs of other families. In the case, it's simply a matter of, because they are black. And in the prison system, there's a sense that you can do whatever you want to people in prison because they have done bad things, whatever it is, and they are exempt from the rules of society. And in prisons, people work for pennies an hour, and they make products that we use. And in the U.S., there's a lot of private prisons. So, I didn't realize that the car wash place down the street from where I live, the men who work in the car wash are prisoners. And they're making pennies an hour. So then the car wash is very profitable because they don't have to pay for labor. And we have a word for when there's labor you don't have to pay for. We call that slavery. But it happens right there. This is in Atlanta, Georgia, a major city in Atlanta. So this idea of families being torn apart, every time someone is in prison, that is a family separation. That if you take a child's parent away, whether or not that child's parent has done something bad or that child's mother has done something that's illegal, that's still a child without a parent. And that ripples out throughout the society. When I was writing An American Marriage, I was really interested in the collateral effects on this particular marriage, but also what does it mean that we live in a society, particularly in the U.S., where prison is just a part of the world, because they call it mass incarceration for a reason. It happens to so many people. And I think of myself, I'm a professor at a major university, and sometimes I sit in a faculty meeting and I think, I'm the only one here probably who knows how to send money to someone in prison. You know, because if someone in prison, if they want socks, if they want, you know, undershirts, whatever, you have to send the money. And I know how to send money to a prisoner because it's just part of the culture. So that was
Wow.
really interesting to me, and just the way it affects people emotionally. Roy is out of prison by page, I think, 98 in this book, because the prison experience wasn't as important to me as the emotional and familial aftershocks. I look at his mother. His mother is the perfect mother for him because she, like I said, she's dedicated her whole life to her son. And now that he's been in prison, her worst fear, she has the resources for that. But you ask yourself the question of this: had her son not been in prison, is she the best mother? Like, is it good to be obsessed with your child? No, it's not if your child doesn't grow up to be wrongfully incarcerated. But he was. So this is the math she has to do in determining how to raise her son. Does she raise him toward the worst possible case scenario, which I think would leave him with a little bit of a broken wing because all of his needs have always been met because she's anticipating this danger. So what is she to do? What is his wife to do? What is anyone to do when this tragedy can swoop down and take you at any moment?
And the research part, because I remember you had a fellowship at Harvard, right, to research criminal law, right, in America. How did you go about the research part of the novel?
The research part, I'm not really that great at it. Whenever I'm on a panel with Essie, I always feel a little bad because she's such a superb researcher, and I'm okay, but I'm not great. I did all this research. I learned so much about prison, but it wasn't story for me in the way I needed story.
You need an inspiration, right? Or facts.
But the thing that helped me most was looking at oral histories. Also, I felt weird, like, because, see, you do historical, but since the people I write about are the kind of people that are alive, I didn't feel comfortable going to someone saying, tell me your trauma, you know, for my book. I mean, it's something gross about that.
Feels exploitative.
Right.
So I looked at oral histories because I feel that anyone telling an oral history wants their story to be out there in that way. And I was struck by the fact that men who were wrongfully in prison, you would think that they would spend all their time talking about the fact that I shouldn't be here, I didn't do this, but they were actually more concerned with the welfare of incarcerated people more generally. They didn't separate themselves out, like, I'm the good person, this person is the bad person. It was more about the way prison affects everyone. And that was the one detail that really surprised me, because when you're imagining the lives of other people, you think that it would all be about his innocence. But he was just about his humanity and the humanity of those around him.
Thank you. And I've promised our panelists to keep 15 minutes for questions and answers, and we can start with that. Okay, I have a lot of questions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we start.
While welcoming the triumvirate to Emirate, I pose a question with regard to the form instead of the content. Firstly, with the very look of the book, I see what is common is the tree in all these 3 books. And I want to know that how far it is good to decide on the form so that such works transform into a movie which will have a wider audience. Thank you.
Very nice question. Form versus content, and do you see your book becoming a movie?
I had a lot of questions about when I was writing the book, because it's a very visual book. People would say, well, did you write it with a view to getting a movie made? Which I always think is a very strange question, because I don't know many literary novelists who start with that. Maybe Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses would be the exception. But no, this isn't something that I have going through my mind. I'm trying to visualize everything and trying to appeal to the senses and to remember to write about smells and taste as well as the visual world. And so the book will be made into a limited TV series, but I won't be the writer on that. And I think everybody should be grateful for that, because I don't have that screenwriter mind, I think, in order to break things down. But I'm curious to see how it will look on the screen.
Would you like to comment on this?
Firstly, are you a Hollywood producer with a checkbook? Because that might affect how I answer this. No, I mean, like Essie, I didn't write with a view to getting a movie deal. I'm obviously not going to turn that down as and when that happens. But I think what you say about form is very interesting, because form and structure is at the heart of the way I write and my approach. So in all my novels, the thing that I think of first of all is the shape of that novel. And this one in particular has a split narrative. So we follow two alternate realities.
Right.
We see what would happen if things worked out the way the mother wants, and if things worked out the way the father did. And that would be an interesting structure to translate to film. So it's something that would intrigue me as a viewer as well as a storyteller.
So I'm curious to know if you began the novel with that structure, and was it conceived with the idea that you're going to
it's so when all this sort of happened to us, do you know the poem by Robert Frost called A Road Not Taken? So he's standing in the yellow woods and he's looking at two paths, and he wants to know what's at the end of it so that he can decide which one to take, which is what we all want. And that's the poem that I had in my head throughout. All this awful decision-making was wanting to, see the end of my yellow woods. And so, that was the inspiration for the structure of the book.
Tayari, do you think about form?
After I finish the book, I see what form I've created. I don't know. I feel like the story tells me which way the form should go. As for the movie thing, I was talking with the screenwriter about making this into a movie, and at the time I wanted to participate, because of course one wants to participate. And she said, she was going to have to change the ending, and I was like, oh no. And she said, well, it's because in a movie things have to be visual. And she said that, this is not a spoiler, but the book ends with an epiphany. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but an epiphany. And she said, an epiphany looks like this. This is what someone looks like having an epiphany. She's like, that cannot be the end of a movie. They got to do something. Because, no one wants to watch anyone think. It's also like why they don't like to have movies about writers.
Yes.
Because it's just like you can't watch someone.
Yeah.
Go get some coffee. That's not a movie, right? And so when she told me that, I was like, oh, I see. It's an entirely different thing than what I'm used to. Because think of how much time you spend how does the person think? How do they feel describing it? But in a screenplay, they got to go do something. And so with that, I politely bowed out, and I am eager to see what it will look like.
We have two questions, the ladies in the front, and then the young man, and then you. Okay.
Hi. So you're talking about relationships under strain, and I think, Tayari, you mentioned that you need to have some friction in order for the story to be interesting and compelling. And whenever in normal life, when you look at relationships, understand if you're involved in it or if you see it happening, sort of a normal kind of instinct would be to turn away from it and not want to see it, bury your head under the sand, or try to change it for the better. Do you ever find yourself having to struggle to not try to make everything into a happy ending? Maybe this is an immature question, but is it hard to make the characters go through all of the trauma and difficulty that they go through?
Well, no, it is difficult because I like the characters and I want the best for them. And as the writer, I can make the best for them. I could make the best for them right now. I could have them win the lottery. I could get him out of jail. I can do whatever I want. And I have to restrain myself because I like to think that people experiencing the situation I would like them to find a way forward with hope, but I also have to make them find a way forward that would be reasonable and realistic for them, because to show someone a happy ending that they can't achieve, that's also just taunting them. So you have to think about how could they find their way out. But at the same time, I try never to write a story that is devoid of hope, because I imagine if someone is living the life I'm writing about, I don't want to distress them further. But it took me a whole year on the last 50 pages of this book to try to find a way forward that was believable and hopeful. But I felt that was my obligation. And I felt like the characters had been through so much that I owed them something. I think the more they suffer, the more I feel obligated to provide just a balm.
I was personally worried how the book is going to end.
I was stressed out.
Right? I was stressed out too.
I
But then
thought somebody
I'm
was
happy
going to
with the
get. I
ending.
thought someone was going to get killed. I was like, oh no, oh no, oh no. It was very stressful.
But I would say I'm happy about the ending, which I'm not going to say.
Yeah, I feel like they
always
worked it
felt
out.
that you come close and you listen to your characters rather than direct them in a certain way.
It is you have to let go of that control, because you have to kind of let, just like with life, you have to kind of let it unfold. Sometimes they go too far though, and I walk it back. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
that's too much. Come back. And then you can flirt around with too much drama in a scene. Like there is an axe involved. Like whenever you have an axe in a scene, it can go off the rails.
Yeah,
Yes.
of course.
So I had to get the axe. I was like, no, it's too much. So, because my impulse, I do the most. Like my impulse is just, it's too much. My personality, sometimes it's just too much for the story. And I do just have to like turn down the volume on it a little bit.
The lady on the second row.
Hi, actually my question to Claire. Yesterday I attended a session about death in the Arabic literature and how religion and culture and heritage affected authors in writing about death. And you are from the other side of the world. How your religion, European heritage and culture affected you in the way you write or you wrote about death?
Wow, that's a big question.
Right.
A big question, quite a personal thing to think about. Do you know what? I'm genuinely not sure I can answer this. Can we talk afterwards? I'd love to talk to you about this, but I need a bit of time. Would that be all right? Come
I
and
would
see me
love to.
afterwards. I'd love to talk to you.
I would love to.
Thank you.
Comments from...
Beautiful. I'm
Thank
very
you.
honest.
Thank you.
The young man in the second row.
Sure. Isi, my question's for you. So in the story, Walsh gets a little obsessed, actually, in terms of finding and coming sort of to some closure with Teach, to the point that it sort of affects his relationship with Tanner. And she conveys that to him. Do you sometimes find a conflict in thinking, when you're writing what Tanner is saying, you're thinking, actually, this is really good advice. Like, you should really listen to this. And is there then a conflict in where you want the story to go?
Yeah, and when I was writing her objections, they were kind of my objections too. Like, your whole life is being derailed because you are obsessed with getting an answer to the question of your origins, and that this is something that, for obvious reasons, is too great an answer to be like a real concrete thing that you're going to get. But I also understood that he was somebody who needed to go through the motions of continuing to search and continuing to try and get that answer. But I also knew that it was an answer that he would never get. And so I've had a lot of questions about the ending, where readers have said, this is very open-ended. Somebody said the other day, couldn't you have just ended it with a marriage with Wash and Tana, just getting together and having a marriage? But to me, that would have been very artificial and tacking something on to fit that kind of a happy ending, because this is somebody who has been through so much, and who really, so many of his I guess, his familial connections and the places where he's gone to get a sense of love. These relationships have been severed. He doesn't see Big Kit again, and his only other early source of love was Tidge, and so he has to sort of try and get that answer. And I understood that this would create an ending in which not everything would be answered, but that enough would be answered for him to be able to go on and try and move past it.
Beautiful. The last question.
Hi, Claire, I have a question for you. My name is Sadia, I'm from Pakistan. I can totally relate to your story because I lost my father last year in Pakistan. And in the end, we were at the same point where we had to decide either we keep him on the intensive care or we let him pass on. And I had a difference with my brother because he wanted to wait. But it's been a year. Every day I go through a different war inside me. Was that a right decision to make? Or was the person whom we were making the decision about, what did he want? I still can't find answers.
Oh, Sadia, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss.
But my question is, do you go through the same thing? Did you went through the same thing?
Every day, Sadia.
And how did you cope with it? I mean,
so I remember talking to my father the day that we were asked to make this decision. My father was a doctor, and it must have been a very hard conversation for him to have about his grandson, but he did it as a doctor, as a professional, not as a grandfather and a father. And he said, you need to think about this decision in relation to the person you're making it for. It's not about you, it's not about the siblings, it's not about anybody else, it's about what is the life that this person wanted. And I knew, actually, so the decision that we made was to remove intensive care because we realized that in keeping my son alive, we would be doing that for us, not for him. The life that we would be giving him was not a life that I would want to live, and I didn't feel it was a life that he would want to live. But the what-ifs are always there, and they're there when I read articles about miracles, about children that were never expected to come through, or adults that were never expected to walk or talk, and here they are, running marathons, and it hurts. It really hurts. But we're still here. We're still standing. I hope your relationship with your brother is okay, and you're still strong. It does get easier. I'm 13 years on, and I promise you it gets easier.
And the book is about that, is about getting better, actually.
I bought your book, so definitely I'm going to read this.
The book is about getting better. It's about life. So that brings us to the end of this session. But before you head off for the book signing, which will take place in the lobby, I would like to thank the AV team, volunteers and translators. It's never an easy task, trust me. Our title sponsor, Emirates Airline, our founding partner, Dubai Culture, our present organization, Emirates Literature Foundation, our session sponsors, and of course the speakers. This was wonderful, and most of all, you, the audience.
And
Thank
our
you.
moderator.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a pleasure.